Major Wakeman Griffin Gribbel, 1881-1929, unsuccessfully dealing with the aftermath of war. The term PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, was only added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual since DSM-3 in 1980. We are currently using DSM-5. Yet we have known about this condition, although inadequately, since the beginning of the written word. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, engraved in clay between 2100 and 1200 BCE, there is an excellent description of the psychological effects of a traumatic experience. Gilgamesh lost his best friend, Enkidu. It was to illness. It was not in battle. But he experienced the usual expected symptoms of grief. But when that phase of mourning passed, Gilgamesh's personality changed, and he raced from place to place in panic when he realized that he too must eventually die. Herodotus first reported chronic mental symptoms from sudden fright in battle during the Battle of Marathon in 440 BCE. He described the Athenians' dread and determination as they prepared for combat. He emphasized the psychological strain of facing death. The chaotic sights, smells, and sounds of the battlefield highlighted the emotional and psychological scars left by war's brutality. We are reminded in Deuteronomy 20, 1-9, that military leaders have long been aware that many soldiers must be removed from the front line because of nervous breakdown. If the sufferer is left in place, the condition can become contagious. When thou goest out to battle against thine enemies, and seest horses and chariots, and a people more than thou, the officers shall say, What man is there that is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return unto his house, lest his brethren's heart faint as well as his heart. That's from the King James Version. Sounds a little like Henry V's speech before the Battle of Agincourt, doesn't it? The Band of Brothers speech. It is important for me to emphasize that symptoms of PTSD are not necessarily caused by a physical wound, like traumatic brain injury, TBI. Between 2000 and 2017, TBI was diagnosed in more than 375,000 military members. PTSD can occur from such things as fright or seeing a comrade killed. These feelings of discomfort persist long after the event. From Herodotus, we find in the Battle of Marathon, Epizelos, the son of Cuphagoras, was fighting in close combat and proving himself a good warrior. Suddenly was deprived of the sight in his eyes, neither having received a blow in any part of his body or having been hit with a missile, and for the rest of his life from this time, he continued to be blind. And I was informed that he used to tell about that which had happened to him, a tale of this kind, namely that it seemed to him that a tall man in full armor stood against him, whose beard overshadowed his whole shield, and this apparition passed him by, but killed his comrade who stood next to him. And that's when he went blind. There was also the secondary benefit of blindness in that a person would now require support and help, did not have to do everything on his or her own. This so-called hysterical blindness, what used to be considered part of a conversion disorder, it's in DSM-5 now as a functional neurologic symptom disorder, FNSD, or dissociative neurological symptoms disorder, DNSD. Frightening battle dreams are mentioned by Hippocrates, and in Lucretius' poem, De Rerum Natura, which was written in 50 BCE. The minds of mortals, often in sleep, will do and dare the same. Kings take the towns by storm, succumb to capture, battle on the field, raise a wild cry as if their throats were cut even then and there. And many wrestle on and groan with pains, and fill all regions round with mighty cries and wild, as if then gnawed by fangs of panther or of lion fierce. Nightmares. French historian Jean Froissart chronicled the 100 Years' War of the 14th and 15th centuries between England and France. He noted the case of Comte Pierre de Beam, who could not sleep near his wife and children because of his habit of getting up in the night and seizing a sword to fight his enemies. Not just sleepwalking, but sleep sword fighting. Soldiers who awakened with frightening dreams of experiences past are a common theme in classical literature. Mercutio's account of Queen Mab in Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet. Excellent example. Sometimes she driveth o'er a soldier's neck, and then dreams he of cutting foreign throats, of breaches, ambuscados, Spanish blades, of health's 5 fathom deep, and then anon drums in his ear, at which he starts and wakes, and being thus frighted, swears a prayer or two, and sleeps again. Historical records from the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, describe soldiers suffering from what was colloquially termed nostalgia or homesickness. This condition was often trivialized, but it included symptoms like severe depression, lethargy, withdrawal. It was not directly linked to the trauma of combat itself. It was simply seen as a longing for the familiar comforts of home. During the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars of the late 18th and 19th centuries, physicians observed that some soldiers would collapse into a protracted stupor after shells brushed past them, even though they were physically unscathed. Goethe described the eerie sound of incoming shells in his memoirs at the Battle of Valmy in 1792. The sound is quite strange, as if it were made up of the spinning of a top, the boiling of water, and the whistling of a bird. He also describes the feeling of depersonalization and derealization that occurs in this environment. I could soon realize that something unusual was happening to me, as if you were in a very hot place, and at the same time impregnated with that heat until you blended completely with the elements surrounding you. Your eyes can still see with the same acuity and sharpness, but it is as if the world had put on a reddish-brown hue that makes the objects and the situation still more scary. I had the impression that everything was being consumed by fire. This situation is one of the most unpleasant that you can experience. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, the introduction of steam-driven machinery gave rise to civilian man-made disasters and cases of PTSD not associated with the battlefield. Survivors of railway disasters who appeared unharmed developed harmful psychological symptoms that puzzled medical personnel. 2 theories grew out of this: physiological versus psychological. Believers in an organic cause placed the blame on microscopic trauma to the brain and spinal cord. Now, this led to conditions known as railway spine and railway brain. At archive.org, you can find an 1867 monograph called On Railway and Other Injuries of the Nervous System. It's a series of 6 lectures that were delivered in London. The American Civil War caused significant psychological and physical impacts on soldiers and civilians alike. Hand-to-hand combat, easy loss of life, prolonged exposure to filth and disease and other traumatic events led to a condition that was called soldier's heart, or, again, nostalgia. Cardiac neurosis was another moniker. The one that seemed to stick was soldier's heart. It also acquired the eponym DaCosta syndrome, named for the Philadelphia physician Jacob Mendez DaCosta. He's interred at Woodland Cemetery in West Philadelphia. These terms all describe a set of symptoms such as anxiety, nightmares, emotional withdrawal, and physical manifestations, palpitations, fatigue, sudden crying. Another term associated with PTSD, the 1,000-yard stare, the empty, glazed appearance of utter exhaustion and dissociation, was not first described as such until World War II. And the 1,000-yard stare is not limited to men in combat. Ask any first responders, paramedics, EMTs, emergency nurses. What are the signs of burnout that you look for in your coworkers? And the 1,000-yard stare is right up there. It's one of the things you look for, that hollow-eyed stare into the unfocused stare into the mid-distance. Now, these conditions were often misunderstood and they were dismissed as weakness or cowardice, and this resulted in a lack of proper support or treatment for those affected. PTSD also affected civilians, especially women and families who face separations, loss, community destruction. Contemporary letters and diaries document the grief and fear and dread due to violence. Veterans struggled to reintegrate into society as they dealt with unseen wounds. The psychological impact of war was recognized only much later and revealed that PTSD was a significant part of the Civil War's legacy. Now, PTSD is almost always described as a human response, implying that man is the only animal to suffer from the condition. But let's say you're a giraffe. You barely escaped being lunch for a lion. And in fact, more than 30% of the giraffes in the Serengeti have scars from prior lion attacks. If this happens, do you go on and live your life normally? There's a vast body of evidence that shows that the brains of all mammals and birds and fish and even some invertebrates share a common basic structure and common responses to terror or joy. The brain circuitry that signals fear and holds memories of terrifying events lies in the amygdala. It's a structure that evolved long before hominids with bulging forebrains came into being. In other words, it's part of the lizard brain. People or other animals with damaged amygdalae can't remember the feeling of fear, and therefore they fail to avoid danger. And it's not just structural change. Hares who are living in a time and place where there is an abundance of predators have smaller litters, and they're spread further apart in time. Now, when the predator problem resolves, it takes those hares a few years before their litters return to normal. So yes, animals can suffer the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. To further add to the chaos of war, armaments improved so that by the 1880s, a sniper could be accurate at more than 1,000 yards and artillery accurate at 6,000 yards. The introduction of smokeless powder made it difficult to see where the bullets were coming from. It was becoming entirely possible to engage the enemy in mortal combat and never expose your own position. In my 6 months in the field in Vietnam, I doubt that I saw the enemy more than a handful of times while we were being fired on. They were shadows. They were moving among the trees, the vines, the undergrowth. The bullets whizzed by, seemingly out of nowhere. The mortar shells just sort of dropped in without a warning, like a bad next-door neighbor. But as far as seeing the enemy and returning fire, virtually impossible. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 was fought by literate soldiers, many of whom were writers. It is arguable that people understand that period more because of poets like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Graves than because of historians and documentarians. Writers who experienced the war understood and could tell of the mental fragility and breakdown, of the pain and the grief caused by war far better than the scholars. Shell shock became the emblematic disorder of the First World War. It was years before the final tally was realized, and historians used the malady as a metaphor for the confusion and the incurable wounds of war. Now, shell shock was initially thought to be a curable temporary condition. When soldiers with the diagnosis returned from overseas duty, they were triaged into curable, and there were a few that were recognized as incurable. They were sent to St. Elizabeth or some other government-run psychiatric unit. Now, many people who suffered from PTSD never acknowledged to themselves that they were sick and therefore did not seek help from the military. Despite this, a survey from February 1927 showed that ex-servicemen with neuropsychiatric disabilities made up 47% of all patients receiving hospital treatment as beneficiaries of the Veterans Bureau. In Germany, up to half of post-war pensions were to men with psychiatric illness. Veteran suicides peaked in the 1930s, with an average of 2 veterans committing suicide every day, and many of these men killed their wives and their children before they took their own lives. The condition was far from rare. An estimated, conservative estimate, 250,000 Great War soldiers suffered from shell shock. But because of underreporting, because of lost records, it was probably 3 or 4 times that many. Remember that more than 3/4 of the records of American World War I veterans were destroyed in that fire in St. Louis in the early 1970s. Also, a lot of Germany's medical records were partially destroyed. The term shell shock was first used in a Lancet article in 1915. The author associated it with the physical shock of being so close to an exploding shell. The French called it commotion cerebrale, or shellitis. German medics referred to victims as Kriegsitters, or war quiverers, or Schüttler, shakers. The Italians were a lot more straightforward. They just called it shock d'explosion. Along with exposure to poison gas, shell shock became the defining injury of the Great War. Major Wakeman Griffin Gribbel was the son of wealthy businessman John Gribbel, who made a fortune in the gas meter business. His business was located at 1513 Reese Street. Griffin, as his friends called him, was primarily a gentleman, a club man, a man of leisure, and he collected art. He'd attended Penn Charter School before he moved on to the university. In 1905, he had a minor scuffle with the law in New York City. Wakeman Griffin Gribbel of Philadelphia, a student in the civil engineering department of the University of Pennsylvania, class of 1905, attracted attention by his queer action in the Hotel Astor early yesterday morning, and later he was taken to Roosevelt Hospital in a state of semi-coma. Evidence that he had taken some drug led the police to put him under arrest on a charge of attempted suicide. "I didn't try to kill myself," he said. "I only took the drug to make me sleep." Gribbel is 24 years old. He lives at a large country estate in Wyncote. Griffin's butler hurried to New York when he got the news and bailed him out and brought the young man back home when the judge cleared him to leave. Griffin was pretty active while he was at Penn. He was president of the junior class, a member of the Glee Club, halfback on the freshman football team, member of freshman and sophomore crew, lots of other activities, and he did graduate with a degree in mechanical engineering. In 1907, Griffin married Margaret Douglas Latta, 1886-1980. They had 4 children together, including identical twins James and William, born in 1921. Griffin and Margaret appear occasionally in the newspaper social columns at particular fundraisers or special events, and they lived in a beautiful house at the corner of Mermaid Lane and St. Martin's, right where Mermaid Lane makes that curve to St. Martin's. You can go straight onto Mermaid Lane, but it I think there's a sign that says no entrance, and you're forced to turn on St. Martin. Anyway, the house sits right there. He joined the U.S. Army. He rapidly ascended to major. He worked with chemicals and gases, and he was slightly injured, and he did undergo gas attack. After what happened later in 1929, newspapers also discovered that since his honorable discharge, Major Gribbel had twice been hospitalized for mental breakdowns or psychotic breaks, which had been blamed on his exposure to gas and other trauma during the war. He became vice president of the gas meter company. He belonged to many social clubs. One of his hobbies was pressed glass, and he had one of the best collections in the Commonwealth. He also specialized in early American furniture, and he had a large collection of models of old sailing ships. Plus, he had an extensive collection of firearms, which he kept scattered around the house. On the date in question, Thursday, January 17th, 1929, Margaret Gribbel called the police and said that her husband's behavior was out of control, that he had access to several weapons, and that he had barricaded himself in a bedroom. She feared for her life and the lives of their 4 children. The twins were then 10 years old. Now, after the war, the major had remained an active pilot. He often flew between Philadelphia and New York City. 4 days before this incident, on a Sunday, he'd had a rough landing in Trenton, New Jersey, and it actually caused some head trauma. He was noticed to have some bruising around his head. But he got into another plane, and he finished the trip back to Philadelphia without further incident. Now, earlier on this day, Thursday, the major had called in his nurse, Miss Margaret O'Donnell of 245 Evergreen Street. That's also in Chestnut Hill, but a good mile away from Mermaid Lane. And he asked her, like you would any good nurse, to clean these 2 weapons. He told me, clean and oil these. They'll shoot better. I took them downstairs and I hid them. Unfortunately, that barely scratched the surface. Later it was found that Major Gribbel had an arsenal of a 34 caliber revolver, a 45 caliber revolver, muzzle-loading 6-cylinder revolver, an air revolver, Colt revolver, several other handguns, long weapons, thousands of rounds of appropriate ammunition, 4 flares, and 2 very large, impressive hunting knives. What happened that night made the next morning's Philadelphia Inquirer and shocked the city. The headline, Inspector Blackburn slain by clubman in Chestnut Hill home, medal winner shot and killed by W.G. Gribbel. Griffin had had another psychotic break. For 4 or 5 days, ever since the incident with the airplane, his behavior was out of control. He was shouting, he was threatening people, he would wave a pistol around, and finally Margaret summoned the police. Now, with her brother, W.J. Latta, and with the family doctor, John McCloskey, they tried to convince Griffin that he needed to be hospitalized. It was time to go back to the sanitarium. Gribbel would hear nothing of it. And at about 9 p.m., he suddenly ran up the stairs and slammed the door to his room, as he often did. The other house residents were alarmed because they knew about the arsenal that he kept in there. Dr. McCloskey summoned police from the Chestnut Hill station. By the time they arrived, Griffin had pretty much driven everyone out of the home, including his parents. Police Inspector John W. Blackburn was with them. He had earned the nickname the Praying Cop. Just by coincidence, he had arrived at the station on his regular nightly inspection only a few minutes before the police were summoned. He was with his faithful chauffeur, Joe Lawrence. The newspaper described as, quote, for years a devoted and inseparable companion, end quote. Now, Blackburn was an award-winning law officer who had earned a Medal of Honor from the city about 2 years earlier, when he faced down an armed, out-of-control man in the cellar of a dwelling on South 6th Street, When General Smedley Butler met him, he commented, "He looks and he sounds like a preacher, but he's a real cop." When he arrived at the Gribbel home, Blackburn noticed that Engine 37 was preparing to raise an extension ladder in the rear of the house. The Major's family met him in the front. They told the inspector that Griffin had threatened to kill anyone who approached him. They laid out a plan, and Blackburn made it plain he did not want gunfire involved. Gribbel shouted down the stairs through his locked bedroom door, "If you come up those stairs, I'll shoot you." There was discussion about using the fire department to flood him out. Finally, they decided on direct action. With Lawrence at his back, Blackburn opened the front door and walked into the vestibule. No sign of Gribbel, but they did not hesitate. Up the stairs directly to the disturbed man's bedroom, and he knocked on the door. It was answered by a volley of shots from the bedroom, but no one was hit. Blackburn obtained a crowbar, and he worked at the door until the lock gave way and the door came off the hinges. They tossed in 2 tear gas bombs, but the noxious fumes did not appear to bother Griffin. 3 officers entered the room. Gribbel stood in the middle of the room with an automatic pistol in his right hand. Blackburn, unarmed, walked toward him and in a quiet voice said, "Come on, old man, you'd better come with me." The old man was 48 years old. Blackburn was 50. It was later found that the 2 men knew each other socially, so I think old man was a term of endearment. Another police officer reported, "I never saw such a looking man as Gribbel was. He was a madman if ever there was one. I only had a second's look before he shot, but I could see that his eyes were dilated and bloodshot. His hair was messed up. He was red in the face, and he was highly excited." The officers moved into the room. They later testified that the suspect reeked of liquor. "I'll kill you," Gribbel screamed as he lifted the weapon, held it at arm's length, and fired twice. One of the bullets struck Blackburn in the left breast and pierced his heart. The other went into his ear. He was dead before he hit the floor. He left behind 5 children, aged 5 to 22. Now, even before the sound of the second bullet had completely faded, faithful chauffeur Joe Lawrence hurtled forward, but he was caught by a bullet in the right chest before he could subdue Gribbel. Other officers rushed forward, but Gribbel, despite being an old man, was quicker, and he dashed into a bathroom where he snapped the lock. A moment later he emerged, breathing heavily in the doorway with a large caliber German revolver in his right hand and a smaller caliber automatic in his left. He had barely crossed the threshold as he started to fire, but a police officer sprang on him, and another officer fired 3 times in rapid succession, and Griffin went down with bullets in his knee, his arm, and his abdomen. And even after 3 bullets, it kept 5 police officers to keep him subdued until he lapsed into unconsciousness. The 3 wounded men were transported to Chestnut Hill Hospital, where Inspector Blackburn was pronounced dead on arrival. Griffin was placed under police guard as he was arrested for murder. Joe Lawrence was initially considered at death's door, but he made recovery and returned to his family and his job on the police force. Now it was between 11 p.m. and midnight. Inspector Blackburn's wife made it a habit to know his schedule and where he might be at any time, so she called the Chestnut Hill station to see if he had visited yet. The station house sergeant told her that he was dead. She screamed, and the sound of the phone receiver hitting the floor could be heard as she fainted. After a briefing, another inspector declared, "I'm investigating this horrible murder to find out why a doctor or a set of doctors would let a crazy man have such dangerous weapons within reach." On Monday, January 21st, 1929, Inspector John W. Blackburn was buried at Westminster Cemetery in Ballackenwood. The services were at a church in Roxborough with an overflow crowd, and thousands of people lined the streets from Manayunk to the cemetery to watch the spectacle of more than 150 cars. It took 6 police patrols simply to transfer all the floral arrangements from the church to the cemetery. When Major Gribbel was released from hospital, he was taken straight to Moyamensing prison, where he was held without bail on a charge of murder, although he was simultaneously held on $2,500 bail on the charge of shooting Joseph Lawrence. March 2nd, 1929, about 5 weeks after the shooting, W. Griffin Gribbel was called an insane man by the city of Philadelphia. When the workman's compensation form was filled out for the slain Inspector Blackburn, his cause of death was listed as occurring, quote, while endeavoring to apprehend an insane man, end quote. This annoyed prosecuting attorneys, who feared that insanity would be the alibi used to justify the murder. County Coroner Fred Schwartz censured the police for entering Gribbel's home without a warrant, even though they had been summoned by the subject's wife. On May 19th, an announcement was made that Major Wakeman Griffin Gribbel would not stand trial for murder, but he would go to the State Hospital for the Criminally Insane at Farview in Wayne County, Pennsylvania. If it is determined in the future that he is cured, he will be tried for murder. It was revealed in the hearing that the Major suffered from chronic alcoholism in addition to, quote, a psychopathic mental makeup, that he has had one or more attacks of a recognized alcoholic psychosis, and that there are reasonable grounds for concluding that he has had recurrent attacks of maniac, sick, depressive insanity that have originated independently of alcoholic indulgence, end quote. The maniac depressive is, of course, bipolar disease. Griffin was only hospitalized at Farview for a few months before he was declared sane and fit for trial. More than a dozen expert witnesses were prepped, including alienists, as psychiatrists were known at that time. They would testify that Gribbel was not responsible for his actions due to alcoholism and acute psychosis and shell shock. Jury selection took 4 hours, and both sides eliminated women from the jury. Major Gribbel looked like he was sitting for a formal portrait, no longer the out-of-control gunman of a year earlier. He was dressed in a dark serge suit, dark tie, spit-polished shoes. A reporter wrote that Griffin's scalp was, quote, almost bare of hirsute adornment, glistened under the feeble lights of the courtroom. His military mustache was waxed stiff and straight, end quote. Griffin barely moved throughout the trial, and he showed no emotion, with 1 or 2 exceptions. After the 12 jurors were selected, the prosecuting attorney outlined his case. We will show that these officers, friends, and relatives of this man did everything in their power to quell this breach of the peace in that house before any effort was made to use force on his person. After an hour had passed, with Inspector Blackburn mortally wounded, 2 courageous officers went into that room at the risk of their lives and took this man in custody. Gribbel deliberately tried to do harm. He had learned that an attempt was to be made to remove him to a sanitarium. He felt that he was above the law and could do as he pleased. He made up his mind he would kill the first person who came into his apartment, and he did. We contend that this was a willful, deliberate, premeditated murder, and that he is guilty of murder in the first degree, end quote. Now, much to my astonishment, the names, ages, and addresses of all 12 jury members were printed in the newspapers, in the Inquirer. On day 2 of the trial, Gribbel lost his composure a little bit only when his massive personal arsenal was put on display. But he sat quietly as the dead man's relatives and former workers testified, as well as through testimony from varying physicians, called by the plaintiff. The Commonwealth concluded its case at 3:30 p.m., and the court closed for that day. The next day, Thursday, February 27th, 1930, 13 months after he had shot and killed Inspector John Blackburn and wounded his colleague Joe Lawrence, Griffin Gribbel sat quietly as his defense team called one witness, Griffin's brother-in-law, to ask him, where did the crowbar come from that was used to break into the bedroom? That was it. There was no testimony about chronic alcoholism, bipolar disease, shell shock, the weapons collection, anything else. Now, when you read accounts of the trial in the newspapers the next day, it was a little tricky at first. The prosecuting attorney, the district attorney, was Kelly, with 2 E's, a second E. The defense attorney was Kelly, no second E. So, prosecutor Kelly's closing argument took 32 minutes. He concluded, almost matter-of-factly, give him back his guns if you feel that way. Let him take them. Go back to Chestnut Hill. But it will be on your conscience, not mine. Defense Kelly was anything but passive-aggressive. He shouted, he pounded tables, he stomped around the room, he gripped the railing for an hour and 26 minutes. Major Gribbel never shot anyone until a flying wedge of 5 policemen came crashing through the sacred portals of his bedroom, crashing him to the floor. Inspector Blackburn rained blows on his face. Policeman Lawrence beat him with a crowbar. Then, and only then, did Major Gribbel shoot in self-defense. It is not wrong to take the law into your own hands when you are harassed and attacked by the Cossack-like methods used by the police in their attack on Major Gribbel. Think of it, gentlemen. Tear gas, crowbars, 20 policemen or more, rushing into a home without a warrant or a commitment or any legal right whatsoever to be there. If this is murder, to shoot to protect your life and property, then we might as well tear up the Constitution. Kelly went on like this for quite a bit longer, and he concluded with, and I say that the first person who breaks open my bedroom door without justification, I will kill him. The defense finished its case at 2:40 p.m. In the judge's instructions to the jury, he reminded them that their decision would send the defendant either to the electric chair, to prison, or back home. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the police had not used a strictly legal process in entering the Gribbel home, so they headed to the jury room with that thought fresh in mind. And after several hours of deliberation, the foreman asked for instructions. Will your honor clarify the points concerning the rights of police to enter a man's home? At 9:15 p.m., the jury returned unanimous verdict, not guilty. For one of the few times in the courtroom, Gribbel showed emotion. His hands and his lips briefly trembled. After handshakes all around, Major Wakeman Griffin Gribbel was released from custody and went home to his mansion on Mermaid Lane in Chestnut Hill, where he'd killed the police officer 13 months earlier. The jury had decided the case based on the Castle Doctrine, established by 17th century British jurist Sir Edward Cope, that a man's home is his castle and he has a right to defend it and himself when unlawfully invaded. The first so-called Stand Your Ground law was not passed until 2005. Well, 2 years later, now it's February 1932, District Attorney Kelly, with 2 E's, brought charges against Griffin for assault and battery with intent to kill Joseph S. Lawrence. If he was convicted this time, he could be sent to prison for 3.5 to 7 years. June 28th, same year, the indictment was dismissed. Gribbel was again unencumbered by the law. Now, in late December of 1932, one of the twins, 11-year-old William, was struck by a car while he played in front of the Mermaid Lane house. He was taken to Chestnut Hill Hospital with a presumed skull fracture in critical condition. But he survived. He actually lived for another 83 years and only died in 2015. The other twin, James Latta Gribbel, died at age 17 in the family summer home in Camden, Maine. William found him dead in his room with a gunshot wound to his head and a pistol by his side. Relatives say, he shot himself accidentally while he was examining the gun. But the insurance company refused to pay out the $25,000 on a policy that had been taken out 16 months earlier, since he died of a self-inflicted wound. 3 days before Christmas, 1939, Major Gribbel was back in the news when he sued his siblings for a larger share of his father's $1 million insurance policy. Or, as he told his sister, there will be another tragedy. His siblings said that Griffin would receive the stipulated share in the estate only upon condition that his personal behavior was acceptable. Gribbel's attorney recalled that he was white with rage at the affront. But the lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and he got nothing. October 25th, 1941, an article in the paper noted that Gribbel was being released from Norristown State Hospital on his 61st birthday after an 8-month stay, with the provision that he abstain from liquor for the next 6 months. Now, whatever demons haunted Major Gribbel, they would not leave him be. December 21st, 1943, Philadelphia. Major Wakeman Griffin Gribbel, socially prominent clubman, World War I veteran, was released on $2,500 bail after being charged yesterday with stabbing Hermano Ferranon, captain of waiters at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, in the throat. Police said that Ferranon testified that Gribbel seized him from behind while they were in one of the hotel elevators and stabbed him in the throat after accusing him of being responsible for the loss of a handkerchief from Gribbel's overcoat pocket. The trial came in June, and Major Gribbel had to post a $50,000 bond, which he would forfeit should he take a drink of intoxicating liquor during a 7-year probationary period, or if he failed to report monthly to Sessions Court. He did not last for 7 years. December 11th, 1946, Wakeman Griffin Gribbel died at his Mermaid Lane mansion at age 66 of a heart attack. He was interred in the family mausoleum in the Ashland section at Laurel Hill West. He's with his parents, his spouse, who outlived him by many years. She didn't die until 1980, and some of the siblings. The stained glass window is kind of sad. It shows some rivers, flowers, trees, birds, but it's in bad shape. It's got a bad sag in it. The doors are interesting. They have some bronze lion-headed door knockers. Now, I mentioned before that I was a medic in Vietnam. Do I have PTSD? I'll let you decide. My own PTSD experience came after I spent a year as an assistant battalion surgeon, 1st Battalion Mechanized, 5th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division. I was with them from May of 68 to May of 69, except for a week in Australia on R&R. I spent about half the time in the field with the battalion aid station. The other half I was in the base camp at Cu Chi, Tay Ninh, Dao Tiang, running the first aid station there. Although I was technically not a front-line troop. Yes, I was shot at by snipers. I was flushed out of the latrine by mortar shells, rousted out of the sack in the back of the track, more than once by rocket-propelled grenades. I had a hammock slung in the back of the track, and I could sleep there. There were mines in the roads. There were booby traps in the trees for the radio antennas to snag and pull out. In other words, death always felt like it was just a few seconds away. The initial few weeks of thinking, I'm going to die at any minute, there was a becalming effect that occurred. And eventually I came to accept that living from day to day was really the only sane way to survive. I also learned quickly to suppress bad experiences. That's a skill that came in handy during my 30 years as an emergency physician also. When I got back to the world in 1969, it did take a few years to shake off the psychic baggage I'd accumulated. Once, while I watched my kid brother's baseball game, a car driving by the field backfired, and I instinctively just backflipped off the bleachers and hit the ground. My wife, Andrea, learned during our first few years together that she should wake me up either by calling my name or standing at the foot of the bed and shaking my toes, because sometimes I would come up swinging. In 1994, this is 25 years after I left Vietnam, I started to work at an ER. In fact, it's the ER where these guys were taken, Chestnut Hill ER, back in 1929. Anyway, I was working at this same ER in 1994. They had an electric stapler that sounded like an AK-47. An AK-47 and an M16 sound nothing alike. And every time somebody used that stapler, I got a little squirt of adrenaline and cortisol that was injected into my system. And to this day, when I go to a restaurant, I insist that I face the door. These issues are trivial. I'm actually one of the lucky Vietnam vets who escaped relatively unscathed, physically, psychologically, and emotionally, unlike 15% of my brothers in arms who carry the PTSD diagnosis. It helped that I wrote home every few days. My mother wrote me every day. I wrote back as much as I could, and my mother saved about 180 of those letters. I found them a few years ago. I've reread them a couple of times, and eventually I will publish them. But I still look at them occasionally to remind myself of what I went through nearly 60 years ago and how I got to where I am today.